What if we tell you whatever you know about Muammar Gaddafi, the former ruler of Libya, is wrong? Whatever you have been told about him has been carefully created by his enemies, the West. In the international world, he is known to be a dictator often called the mad dog of the Middle East, who ruled his nation with an iron hand. However, the reality is far from this. The history books which call him dictator have been actually written by his enemy. You can never trust the explanations and facts given by one's enemy. In Africa, he was a revolutionary leader with dreams to unite all African countries and make a united Africa. This was a threat to the West, so they orchestrated his downfall and got him terminated. However, his ideologies did not go to waste and are being revived today. That's why we are seeing African military leaders kicking the West out and becoming independent and autonomous. So, what are the things which Muammar Gaddafi's death taught other African leaders, which they are following particularly now? Let's find that out and know the real history that stayed hidden. Number 5. The Dream of United Africa. The dream of a unified Africa was a brainchild of Muammar Gaddafi. Dissatisfied with the existing state of affairs, he firmly believed that Africa's true strength lay in its unity. Gaddafi's grand plan revolved around the concept of a United States of Africa, a bold and audacious idea that captured the attention of leaders across the African continent. However, the potential realization of this vision posed a significant challenge to Western powers. Don't think that United Africa had plans to attack the West. Rather, things were quite the opposite. The West has a flawed thinking process that if something in the world becomes powerful, it poses a threat to it. Therefore, the West destroys everything which is destined to be more powerful than the West. A crucial moment occurred during the 2009 African Union Summit held in Libya. In his speech, Gaddafi emphasized the critical importance of African unity and proposed the establishment of a single African government, a common currency, and a unified military force. On that very day, the West had decided Gaddafi was a direct threat to Western supremacy. Number 4. Self-reliance and absolute independence. Gaddafi understood the difference between real and illusioned independence. He knew how France was still controlling the African nations it once ruled. Hence, he clearly knew that if he was to unite Africa, he first had to make it independent. This could be only done by offering self-reliance and economic independence to all African countries. Hence, Gaddafi's leadership was marked by a commitment to self-reliance and economic independence, leaving a profound impact on other African leaders. He recognized the importance of guiding nations toward economic autonomy, a quality few leaders possessed at the time. Historically, African countries heavily relied on foreign aid and loans, rendering them vulnerable and powerless. Gaddafi's Libya served as a prime example of what could be achieved when a nation prioritizes self-sufficiency. He made substantial investments in Libya's infrastructure, education, and industries, transforming it from a nation heavily dependent on foreign aid into one with a diversified and robust economy. African leaders witnessed how Gaddafi harnessed Libya's substantial oil wealth to fund ambitious development projects, which not only improved the quality of life for Libyans, but also reduced the country's susceptibility to economic pressures from foreign powers. One unprecedented initiative was Gaddafi's proposal for an African currency, the gold dinar, backed by gold reserves. This currency aimed to replace the US dollar in African trade, reducing Africa's reliance on Western currencies and strengthening its economic independence. Additionally, Gaddafi advocated for economic cooperation among African nations. He believed that by pooling resources and expertise, African countries could create a more self-reliant continent. Initiatives such as the establishment of the African Investment Bank and the African Monetary Fund were designed to promote economic integration and reduce dependence on Western financial institutions. Number 3. Diversification of alliances. The West has an inherent wish to make other countries dependent on it for protection and aid. Hence, the West wants countries to only ally with it and not with anyone else. However, Gaddafi was a different leader who understood how important it was for his country and Africa as a whole to forge alliances. Muammar Gaddafi had a knack for forging partnerships which often goes unnoticed. Gaddafi's strategy of reaching out to countries beyond the Western sphere to build alliances is nothing short of intriguing. He was not content with limiting his alliances to a select few. Instead, he believed in the power of establishing connections with nations, both large and small. Gaddafi's outreach extended not only to African nations but also to countries in the Middle East, Asia, and even some in Latin America. He grasped the notion that depending solely on a handful of powerful allies could be a risky policy and take you nowhere. Hence, By diversifying his diplomatic relationships, he ensured that Libya had a broad support base on the international stage. African leaders closely observed Gaddafi's tactical use of these diverse alliances to ensure that their country was not left alone if the West took its hand back. His ability to strike deals and negotiate on multiple fronts played a pivotal role in helping Libya maintain its sovereignty and economic stability, even when facing pressure from Western nations. A vivid example of Gaddafi's diplomatic wit occurred in 2008 during the conflict between Russia and Georgia over the breakaway regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Gaddafi strategically forged an alliance with Russia during this period. This move showcased his skill in reaching out to countries outside the Western sphere of influence. At that time, Western nations, particularly the United States and the European Union, were critical of Russia's actions in Georgia. However, Gaddafi publicly supported Russia's stance in the conflict, praised its position, and criticized Western intervention in the region. This alignment with Moscow on the global stage demonstrated Gaddafi's boldness to make decisions which were beneficial for his country, even if they were against the West. What's happening in Africa right now takes its roots from Gaddafi's philosophy. As the influence of the United States and the European Union in Africa wanes, African leaders in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso are leaving the West and turning to Russia for cooperation. For instance, Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso has engaged in discussions with the Russian military about potential agreements. He has also urged African leaders to prioritize the interests of their people, much like Gaddafi did. Number 2, handling external influence. Wisely, Muammar Gaddafi was not just a ruler. His wit allowed him to be a diplomat and statesman who knew how to handle things which other leaders could not. Throughout his tenure, he faced relentless opposition and sanctions from Western powers. However, he stood resolute in defending Libya's sovereignty instead of giving up. African leaders, who were no strangers to external pressures themselves, closely observed Gaddafi's tireless commitment to safeguarding his nation's autonomy. They watched as he passionately championed Africa's right to self-determination, even when it meant confronting global giants. Gaddafi's refusal to yield to external pressures was not just a spectacle. It was a lesson in courage and resilience. What truly captivated African leaders was Gaddafi's ability to rally support both within Africa and from like-minded nations worldwide. This showcased the immense influence of a determined leader on the global stage. This lesson proved timely as African nations grappled with various forms of external influence, ranging from economic coercion to political interventions. What African leaders of Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali are doing now was done first by Gaddafi. He was the first man in Africa who could withstand external pressure without budging from his stand. He knew he was alone and no other leader was behind him to support him. Despite this, he stood strong and made the world respect him and his country. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Number 5, the power of strategic planning. In the early 2000s, Libya found itself grappling with international isolation due to allegations of involvement in various acts of terrorism, including the infamous 1988 Lockerbie bombing and the bombing of a Berlin nightclub in 1986. Consequently, the United Nations imposed sanctions on Libya, severely curtailing its international engagements. In 2003, Muammar Gaddafi made a calculated strategic move to negotiate a settlement with Western nations, aiming to lift the sanctions and reintegrate Libya into the global community. How he did this is something nobody could understand. He single-handedly managed and talked with the Western leaders and got what he wanted was more than impressive. This was because of Gaddafi's exceptional strategic acumen. He was not merely reactive to events. He meticulously anticipated and planned for them. For instance, Gaddafi's Libya was not just fortunate to possess oil wealth, it was strategically managed. He harnessed Libya's vast oil reserves to finance ambitious development projects aimed at securing the country's future. Libya, despite being a desert nation, witnessed the construction of an extensive water distribution system, ensuring access to water for all Libyans. However, it's worth noting that NATO was determined to destroy this pipeline during its intervention, leading to Gaddafi's tragic demise. Today, after 12 years since his death, both civilian and military leaders are trying to follow Gaddafi's legacy. African leaders have started strategic planning, choosing allies wisely. They are prioritizing the development of their industries, investing in technology and innovation, and implementing policies geared toward long-term stability. But why was Gaddafi killed? It was in 2016, with the publication of Hillary Clinton's emails, that the true motivation behind NATO's involvement in Libya became evident. The mission was driven by the desire to prevent the creation of an independent hard currency in Africa, one that would liberate the continent from its economic dependence on the dollar, the IMF, and the French African franc. This independent currency held the promise of breaking the last chains of colonial exploitation that had plagued Africa for so long. Back in October 2011, then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's brief visit to Libya was celebrated in the media as a victory lap. She famously declared, "We came, we saw, he died," upon learning of the capture and brutal killing of Libyan leader Muammar el-Gaddafi. The US NATO intervention had been justified on humanitarian grounds, citing reports of mass atrocities under Gaddafi's rule. Yet, human rights organizations later questioned these claims due to a lack of evidence. Interestingly, verifiable atrocities did occur in the years after Gaddafi's death, showing that the entire narrative to show Gaddafi as an evil dictator was flawed. You should know that the creation of an independent hard currency in Africa, famously known as Gaddafi's gold dinar, had the potential to free the continent from the last vestiges of colonial exploitation. Before 2011, Libya had achieved economic independence, boasting its own water, food, oil, money, and state-owned bank. Education and medical treatment were provided for free, and Libyans enjoyed a unique system of local democracy. The country even initiated the world's largest irrigation system, the Great Man-Made River Project, to bring water from the desert to urban and coastal areas. Gaddafi intended to spread this model throughout Africa. However, during the US-NATO intervention, Libya's irrigation system was bombed, and the nation was plunged into turmoil. Clinton's emails unveiled a different agenda behind the Libyan war, one that appears to have been achieved. Among the 3,000 emails from Hillary Clinton's private server, approximately a third were from her close confidant, Sidney Blumenthal. One of these emails, dated April 2, 2011, revealed that Gaddafi's government holds 143 tons of gold and a similar amount in silver. This substantial precious metal reserve was intended to establish a pan-African currency based on the Libyan gold dinar, providing Francophone African countries with an alternative to the French franc. According to the original declassified email, this gold and silver hoard was valued at more than $7 billion. French intelligence had become aware of this plan early in the rebellion, influencing President Nicolas Sarkozy's decision to commit France to the attack on Libya. The objectives were clear: securing a greater share of Libya's oil production, increasing French influence in North Africa, addressing domestic political concerns in France, bolstering the French military's global position, and countering Gaddafi's ambitions to replace France as the dominant power in Francophone Africa. Notably absent from these objectives was any mention of humanitarian concerns. The primary drivers were money, power, and oil. Investigative journalist Robert Perry also uncovered admissions of rebel war crimes, the presence of special ops trainers in Libya from the early stages of protests, and the infiltration of al-Qaeda into the US-backed opposition. You should know that Muammar Gaddafi's bold endeavor to establish an independent African currency did not sit well with Western interests. Hence, in 2011, French President Nicolas Sarkozy labeled the Libyan leader as a threat to the world's financial stability. Yes, you see, someone who seemed to challenge the French brutal post-colonial financial system in Africa was deemed a threat to the entire world. That's when the question arose: how could a small country with a population of 6 million pose such a significant threat? To grasp this, we need some context. In Western economies, it's not governments but banks that predominantly create money, a practice that has endured for centuries through fractional reserve lending. Initially, these reserves were held in gold. In 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt replaced domestic gold reserves with centrally bank-created ones, but gold retained its international status as a reserve currency. In 1944, the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and the World Bank were established in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to globalize this privately created money system. An IMF ruling dictated that paper money could no longer be backed by gold. This effectively meant that the money supply was now generated privately as debt with interest. This system demanded a continuous stream of debtors, causing most developing countries over the next 5 decades to fall into debt with the IMF. These loans came with conditions. including austerity measures and privatization of public assets, known as structural adjustment policies. After 1944, the US dollar functioned interchangeably with gold as the global reserve currency. When the US could no longer maintain the dollar's gold backing in the 1970s, it struck a deal with OPEC to support the dollar with oil, creating the petrodollar. It meant that oil would exclusively be sold in US dollars, which were then deposited in Wall Street and other international banks. In 2001, displeased with the diminishing value of the dollars they received for their oil, Saddam Hussein of Iraq broke the pact and began selling oil in euros. This act led to regime change and the widespread devastation of the country. We know what was done with Saddam Hussein simply because he challenged the petrodollar. You see, these violent interventions were not primarily driven by concern for the safety of the people. They were fundamentally about money, oil, and the interests of global banking. In Libya, Gaddafi also defied the pact. Gaddafi conceived and financed a plan to unify the sovereign states of Africa with one gold currency. He was not simply rejecting petrodollar, he was presenting his own. In 2004, a Pan-African parliament of 53 nations laid plans for the African Economic Community with a single gold currency by 2023. If Gaddafi was alive today, there would be a gold dinar and no US dollar. When NATO entered Libya, it bombed Gaddafi's largest river project, which supplied water to 70% of the population. Was not this action a war crime, especially by the very countries advocating humanitarianism? Hillary Clinton's emails shed light on another puzzling aspect noted by early observers. Why did the rebel forces, within weeks of initiating their uprising, establish their own central bank? In 2011, Robert Wenzel wrote in the Economic Policy Journal, "This suggests we have a bit more than a ragtag bunch of rebels running around, and that there are some pretty sophisticated influences. I have never before heard of a central bank being created in just a matter of weeks out of a popular uprising." The matter might have remained a suspicious but unverified anomaly, like many stories of corruption and fraud, had it not been for the release of Hillary Clinton's emails following an FBI investigation. These emails lend substantial weight to the suspicion that violent intervention was primarily about safeguarding money, oil, and the interests of global banking, rather than ensuring the safety and security of the Libyan people. What do you think? Was Muammar Gaddafi a threat to his own people or the West? Isn't it true that the West got him terminated much like they did with Saddam Hussein? Let us know your thoughts on whether the West can repeat this with current African leaders who have grown stronger than ever. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.